Well, welcome to our discussion of the Halotcha, Moshe's worst blunder. Of course, everybody knows that, generally speaking, we think of Moshe's worst blunder. What do we think of? The hitting of the rock. However, if we look in our Parsha, we can find at least two other sins that seem equally egregious, or perhaps egregious enough to warrant certainly consternation, perhaps some sort of punishment. But sometimes they're often overlooked. Let's take a look at them. So I'm going to share the screen and we'll go from there. We have Moshe's eyes. The first problem is Moshe's eyes. Well, Moshe turns to Chovav, Ben Ruel, Midyani, Chotein Moshe. Why is a different name? We don't know, but it seems to be Jethro with a different name. And he turns to him and he says, Nosim anachnu el makom asher amar Hashem, oto eten lachem. He says, look, we're traveling, we're ready to go. That's it. We set up the camp, Bamidbar, Naso. We're in Balotcha, Vayivin Saron. We're ready to go to Israel. And Lacha itanu, veitabnu lach. You, Jethro, Yitro, you come with us, and we'll make it good for you. It'll be good for you. Because Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, because God is only bringing good things to the Jews. So it's going to be great. So come on with us. Vayomer elav lo elech. So he said, no, I'm not coming with you. I'm going to my homeland. I'm going to my nation. It seems like the reverse of Abraham. Abraham was told to leave Artzacha, his land, Moladcha, his homeland. And Jethro says he's going back. Perhaps in an inverse conversion, Jethro had perhaps converted. He's going back. Or perhaps he never fully converted. Vayomer, so Moshe says to his father-in-law, Al na tazov itanu. Please don't leave us. You know our encampment in the desert. You know, you're a desert man. You're a Midianite. When I was wandering the desert, I met you and I met my wife, your daughter. And you should be Vayita lanu le'inayim. You will be our eyes. This is the expression I'd like to examine this afternoon. What does it mean? Moshe says that Jethro will be his eyes. So Moshe continues, if you come with us, whatever good God will bring to us, because he's promised to do us good, it'll be good for you too. So please come with us. No conclusion. That's it. He doesn't say what happened. Some say he did come with him, he didn't come. The general assumption is he went back, but eventually he came back to some degree, and there were people to this day, the Druze perhaps in Israel, were of his kin. When Yael, the days of Devorah, who chopped off the enemy's head, she was from the Canaanite, she was from this family. Okay. So the question is, why did Moshe say, you shall be our eyes? Is that okay to say that Jethro would be their eyes? Well, here's the problem. We just got through saying that the cloud will guide us. The trumpets will guide us. The last section was about trumpets. And then it said the cloud, when the cloud goes up, the Jews move. When the trumpets blow from the Kohanim, then the people move. So how could he say that Jethro is going to be their eyes? God is their guide. They've been guided for a whole year now by God. So all the commentators try to explain that Moshe didn't mean what he said. Rashi, one interpretation, you are like our eyes. What is your eye? You never take your eyes off your eye. Meaning, why? Because you love your eye, you love yourself. So you'll be as beloved to us as our own eyes. It's not an English expression, but apparently in Hebrew it works. Why? How do we know that we're going to love you so much? We love converts. So you're going to be in great shape. Ibn Ezra, in one interpretation, says that Vayita lanu le'inayim la'arot haderech. He says it explicitly. You're going to show us the way, which is problematic from my perspective. However, some people say that you already did give us guidance. You're going to be our eyes. It means you did give us guidance. When was that? When Moshe was given advice by Yitro to delegate, that Moshe should not do all the judging, he should delegate.
That's
so you've
right.
been our eyes in the past, not in the future, but you have been our eyes. Similarly, the Rashbam, you gave us a great advice earlier on in the Jethro story in Exodus 18. Rav Yosef Bechor was a French rabbi after Rashi era, and he said, "You will be our eyes," meaning anyone who sees you with us will say, I wonder why this great man, who is a Kohen, a prince of the Midianites, why would he leave his people and go with the Jews? If not, that God is with them. And then other people will want to join us as well, and they will be afraid to fight against us. So you will set the model. You will be the eyes. You will be the eyes of the people. You'll be the poster boy for joining the Jewish people, for being afraid and in awe of the great God of the Israelites. Sforno, Spanish and Italian commentator, he says, if you leave us, that will be a great desecration of God's name. They'll say, if Jethro, who saw all the miracles, he talked to Moshe, if he leaves, then then it's terrible. But he says, no. But apparently Jethro did leave, but his children came back, as it says in the book of Judges. Okay. Shadal was a rabbi, really more of a professor of Bible and other things from the 19th century. So he said, he's not asking Jethro to be a co-leader. He's not asking Jethro to be the tour guide. No way. He says, akavana ki beyodlam chanaya al bekamot b'midbar. Ineu sham bakibim kamotayim yuchal la'ir einehem b'chama inyanim pratiyim shachulayim chaniyatam b'li shitzarech tamid l'maseh nisim. Very interesting. He says, look, you know the way. We're going to be in the desert for a while. Now, they didn't expect to be in the desert that long. They're hoping to go to Israel soon. But whatever extent we're going to be there, you know the different merchants, the merchant paths when they pass through the desert. It's not the Sahara Desert here. People pass through in Jordan, in the Negev of Israel. And you know when they pass through where we could stop. We don't need a nace, a miracle, every time we need a glass of water. You know where things are in the desert. You're an expert, like the Nabateans were experts in the desert. So he says that that's why. So in other words, yes, God does miracles, but we don't need a miracle every minute. We need somebody with us who has practical knowledge. So it's an interesting twist. We're asking a question: why did Moshe say that Jethro is the eyes, God is the eyes? So the answer is, okay, God is the eyes, but God will guide us. But there could be some things that could use some practical advice. You also don't want to overly rely on miracles. I believe it's Shadal continues to say, it might be a different commentary, I got it mixed up. He says, you'll come with us even when we conquer Israel. And he says, usually, Einayim does not mean, doesn't mean leader, doesn't mean guide. He thinks that it means someone who will be ma'ayin ro'eh. You'll be like our accountant. You know, we have some accountants online. Will guide us as to what to do. That type of thing. Marie Carra is another French commentator. He says, you will enlighten our eyes, and as you did when you gave advice to Moses. Now there are targum, there are official translations of this. Let's see what they say. The Ungla says, you have seen the great miracles that God did. Ungla is afraid to translate that you're going to be the eyes. That's against, you can't say that. God is the eyes. So he says, no, you were the eyes. You saw the great things that happened. It's another translation called Yerushalmi, Targum Yerushalmi. He says, he says, you will see the Nisaya, the miracles that God did was Iman in every place. And you will be our eyes, our witness of all these wonderful things that happen. We need an outside party to witness these things. The Targum Jonathan ben Uziel, they say it's a pseudo Jonathan, whatever it is. He says, you will join the Sanhedrin, you'll teach us different laws, and you will be as beloved to us like our eyes, as Rashi mentioned. Ben Bachya says as follows. Once the Jews are going according to the clouds, we know the Jews are following the clouds. So he says, what do you need Jethro for? Rather, Moshe said, he says, we need to support and strengthen those people of little faith. Oh, ye of little faith. Those who have little faith, they need someone like you so they'll feel confident. They're afraid to trust this, to trust God, and they would be stronger if they'd feel better if there was a person who was competent in guiding them through the desert. So Rabbi Bachya claims that it's not for Moshe. Moshe, God forbid, Moshe doesn't need Jethro. But you know who needs Jethro? The people of little faith, K'tanei Amana. They need some strengthening to see a human being who knows the way. So according to just about everybody, Moshe did nothing wrong, right? Moshe did nothing wrong. All the commentators say doesn't mean what it says. He did, God forbid, he never asked Jethro to lead them in the desert. But there is a Rashi later on that quotes a Midrash that could hint to even some of the rabbis thinking that maybe Moshe made a mistake. In order to understand this Rashi, we need to look at the structure, as we did last week, structure of the Parsha. On Monday, we talked about the structure of Baloscha. Here it is. So just looking at the sections that we're dealing with right now, not the whole Parsha. Number one, there was a cloud that came with the Mishkan and had guided them in their travels. Number two, there were trumpets that would guide them in their travels. And the trumpets are also a prayer in distress in the future when they go to Israel. Then it says how they traveled indeed with this method, with their tribes and the leaders and the clouds. And then Moshe requests of Yitro Chovav to stay with them and to be their eyes, which we're wondering what kind of story that is. And then they traveled from the mountain of God, the way of 3 days. And the cloud of God was on them for 3 days ahead as they traveled from the camp. Midrash says that when they traveled from the mountain of God, they ran like children running from school. That's not good. Then there's an upside down nun. Nun goes, let's say, this way, but they put it that way. And like a bracket. It looked like parentheses, but like a backward parentheses. What is that? What's in the bracket? The prayer for the moving and stopping. We know it very well from Shul. When we open the ark, we say, Vahiv and so Aaron, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem, Yafutzu Avecha. When the ark traveled, Moshe said, rise up, O God, and may all the enemies run away, and may the enemies run from us. And then when they put down the ark, they would say, Shuv Hashem, we have a video about that. He would say, look, God, help the troops return Shuvah, or let all the thousands and myriads of 600,000 Jews, let them be rest and not have any worries. In any event, that section is bracketed off by brackets, which is very strange. You don't usually have brackets in the Torah. Upside down nuns, backwards nuns. What's after that? Then you have the complainers who were burned by the fire from God, and you have Safsuf who complained for meat, and the ensuing discussion about that. So Rashi says, why are there brackets? Why are there brackets at this particular point about when they traveled, about what they said when they traveled, when they stopped? So Rashi says, he put signs before and after it to say this is not the place. It doesn't really belong here. So why is it written over here? Lafsik ben paranut leparnut. As it says in the Gemara in Shabbos, Sit 116. In order to distinguish between the punishments and the punishments, that's why we have this section. So let's go back to that section again. The outline. We had these upside down nuns to distinguish between the punishment and the punishment. So which punishment? So Rashi in Gemara says, well, you have the complainers and you have Safsuf who complain. So it interrupts the punishers. So the Tosfot says, Ramban says, what? The brackets are not in between 7 and 8, between the complainers and the other complainers. They're before the complainers. So what punishment, what problem, what bad thing was before the upside down noon? Everything seemed great. What did we say? We said that the cloud was guided them. They had trumpets to guide them. They asked Yitro to stay with them. He didn't want to come. Then they traveled to the mountain of God for 3 days, and the cloud of God went ahead of them. And then they had complainers. There's nothing wrong before the brackets. Why do we need the brackets to break up between the bad and the bad, between the punishment and the punishment, between something evil and something evil? There's nothing evil before the brackets. So again, you could say that somehow it's about the ensuing troubles that are coming. So let's see. Why did Rashi put brackets? So what does it mean? So the Ramban says that the previous section is problematic because they were running away from God. So if they're running away from God, that was the bad thing, number one. And then to distinguish and to break up between running away from God, running away from Mount Sinai, and the complaining, we break it up with this nice little section of Ayib and so Aaron, Moshe, Yoman, what we say when the rest ark rests. So we put that in between the sin of running away from Sinai and the sin of the complainers. That's the view of the Ramban. Problem is, that sin is in the Midrash. It's not in the text itself. It says the Jews traveled from the mountain of God. I mean, they had to leave the mountain of God. So it says they went from the mountain of God. So what's the problem? So it's not the simple reading of the text. That reading of the Ramban, that the bad before the brackets is the running away from God, is based on a Midrash. It's not based on the simple text. So that's the Ramban. A professor at Bar Ilan suggested the following. He says, Ulam acharei chod hakol. The truth is, after all is said and done, if you read the simple reading of what Moshe asked Jethro, it looks like he's looking for human help in addition to God. It seems that he's a little bit of a lack of complete faith in the guidance of God from heaven. So, and it could be, maybe that was the first trouble that they had. And he somehow says that Barbanel says something similar. Let's see what he says. Barbanel says, because Yitro did not want to go, we had to have the God guide us for those days. Maybe it's alluding to the problem that we were thinking of going with Jethro, but then we had to go with God. But the point is that there's a suggestion that maybe, despite the hesitancy of so many commentaries not to blame Moses for this statement, there is a possibility in the simple reading of the text that Moshe misspoke. He was talking to his father-in-law, and he said, "Oh, why don't you come with us?" One commentator suggested that when he said, he didn't really mean it. Moshe knew that God guided them, but he said, "Oh no, you would be such a great help. You know the way in the desert." He was just being polite, trying to encourage him to come. He didn't need him, and Moshe didn't believe it. But despite all the efforts to justify Moshe's statements, one could easily say that Moshe misspoke, and that the rabbis in the Midrash are actually alluding to that. The Gemara in Shabbos alluding to that. They said something bad here, something smells foul, and it's not the Jews running away from the mountain. It's the previous verse. It's Moshe asking for Jethro to be their eyes.
Rabbi?
Yes.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. I was just thinking, Moses was going through a terrible dilemma at the time, trying to deal with all these issues being raised by the people. And in many ways, you almost felt that he was frustrated in his talking to God or communicating with God. And I think when you find that you are so lonely and you cannot reach out and get an explanation, only person that he could turn to was his father-in-law, because he saw him as an independent outsider, although related, that could give him a view of what the situation was. I mean, that's just the way I'm reading it, because I know Moses was going through a tremendous struggle. He was literally the lonely man, and he had all these burdens on him. And here he was trying to reach out to somebody. In his loneliness, he was reaching out to an individual. And in many ways, he was not disregarding God. He was possibly undermining his own ability to communicate with God. I'm trying to do that from a humility point of view. But that's just my
Yes.
perception. I apologize if I am
Very good.
misinterpreting.
No, it's excellent. What I like about Malcolm's idea is, number one, he's looking at Moshe as a human being. Moshe Lichtenstein wrote a whole book about how we need to look at the biblical characters as real people. Otherwise, it's fairy tales. So Moshe is a real person. He has very little support. Of course, at this point, this is the breaking point. You know, in the book of Bamidbar, everything's portrayed as very rosy, and then there's a breaking point. But yes, nonetheless, it's lonely being a leader. And surely he wanted some help. And although some commentators we read said that he wasn't asking for a co-leader, maybe he was. He very much liked Jethro. We know that Moshe, more than he married his wife, he chose to live with his father-in-law. He really liked his father-in-law. Ayol Moshe Lashavadish. Moshe agreed to live with his father-in-law. The wife came with it. So he loves this man, and they must have a very deep relationship. Elijah ben Amozi, Italian rabbi and philosopher, suggests that Jethro and he had an intellectual relationship, which surely they did, spiritual relationship. And so he wants him to come with him. And now you also suggest a second thing, which is that his relationship with God, he doesn't want to rely completely on his relationship with God because he's so modest, and because it's scary to rely completely on God. Who knows if he's going to come today, tomorrow? Generally, I think Rashi points out that it's amazing. Moshe can just say, okay, God, let's find out the answers to that question. You want to bring a Paschal lamb on the second month? Let's see. God, what can we do that? He just turns to him right away. So he has tremendous confidence in his ability to speak to God. Maybe at some level, he feels like we need plan B. I mean, what if God doesn't answer? Or, what would be? So that's a very good human way of looking at it. I like it. I'm going to suggest something that's not so far from that. Later on, we'll get to it. Thank you. And we welcome Sherry and Steve and Mark Hayden, who's here with us. And nice to have you with us. All welcome to one and all. And everyone's welcome to chime in anytime you'd like. The other major possible blunder in our parsha is much more well-known, and it's widely debated going back to the Midrashic days, and that is the following. The people start complaining. As we saw, there were two complaints. One group, they got swept away by the fire. The next one, Moshe says, God, I can't take it anymore. As Malcolm said, he's deeply frustrated at this point. I'm not sure he was frustrated before. It's portrayed as if the frustration begins now. But he says, I'm very frustrated. But anyway, he says, look, tell the people, prepare yourselves. Tomorrow you're going to eat meat. You want meat? You'll have meat. You're crying in my eyes saying, who's going to give us meat? We like it better in Egypt. God is going to give you meat and you're going to eat it. Not one day, not 2 days, not 2, not 5, not 10, not 20 days. A month you're going to have meat until it's coming out of your noses. Because we know when it comes to hedonism, there's a point at which the steak doesn't taste too good anymore. And it'll be strange to you by that point. Why? Because you have despised God who is with you, and you cried in front of him saying, why did you take us out of Egypt? You bunch of ingrates. So I'm going to give it to you, and I'm giving it to you with anger. So Moshe says, there's 600,000 people, and I'm among whom I sit. And you said we're going to give them meat, and they're going to eat for a month for 600,000 people? Do you know what kind of bill that would run up? Do you know how we're going to get that kind of thing? He says, could you slaughter enough sheep and cattle for them and find it for them? If you could gather in forget about meat, if you could get fish, if you could get all the fish in the sea, do you think it'd be enough for these people? They'd complain anyway. There's not enough meat here. Now this is very strange. This seems to be Moshe doubting God's ability to do what he said he would do. Hashem says to Moshe, will the hand of God be short? You will now see if my word will come true or not. It doesn't say God got angry, but it's a pretty strong question. Can the hand of God be short? Apparently, Moshe was questioning whether the hand of God could be short. So how are we going to explain this tremendous? The fact that Moshe misspoke would be one thing, but the idea that in the end he can't go to Israel because he hit a rock, which God told him to speak to the rock and he hit the rock, or 10 other interpretations of what the problem with that rock speaking was. Whatever it was, doesn't seem to be as bad as saying that God can't do what he said he would do. And it sort of has echoes of what we said before, that Jethro is going to show them the way and not God. Doesn't it sound familiar? So Rashi says, no. He says, Rabbi Akiva said, look, there's 600,000 people, and you're going to give them meat? It means what it says. It means what it says. So he says, well, in that case, which one is worse? Hitting the rock or calling the Jews rebels when he hit the rock? Or this one? He says, really, this one was said privately. So God says, I'll give you a pass on this one, but I'll punish you later. I'll punish you in public when you don't hit the rock, when you do hit the rock. So according to Rabbi Akiva, strangely enough, he's usually the softy. He says this sin is worse than the hitting of the rock. This is why he eventually dies. But God pretends that it's because of something else, because this was private. God didn't want to make it so public. Of course, we read about it, but it's still private. However, Reb Shimon says, I don't agree with you, Rabbi Akiva. This is one of the cases where Reb Shimon did not agree with Rabbi Akiva, his Rebbe. Chas v'sholom, God forbid. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, a pietist, as was Rabbi Akiva, but he couldn't take this. He said, no, God forbid that righteous man, Moshe, would do something like this. No. We know it says, Bechol beitin yamanu. It says later in this parsha that in all of God's recesses of his house, so to speak, every chamber of God universe, Moses is faithful. So he's faithful. So how could he say something like this? Rather, it means like this. You have 600,000 people. You said you're going to give them meat, and then you're going to kill them because you're really mad at them. He says, you're going to kill a great nation like this? And is this nice on your part? Would that be a beautiful thing on your part? Did you ever take a donkey and you say, here, take as much as you want, eat as much as you want, then we'll cut your head off? It's not nice. So God said to him, but if I don't give it to them, they'll say that I can't produce. So he said, I'd rather them all die and let them not say that I don't have enough power to give them meat in the middle of the desert. So Rav Shimon Yochai makes God sound kind of harsh, but he is willing to do that in order to soften the blow so that Moshe would not be accused of having questioned God's basic ability to produce something. So that's Rashi, two interpretations. One is that indeed this is one of the worst blunders of Moshe. This is the worst blunder of Moshe. And God spared him at this moment, but later he didn't. The Ramban says, I'll tell you. He says, look, when God did the various miracles, it was a great kindness, and it was all good for us. And God is very kind. So he says, but this isn't right. To give kindness to us when you're mad at us, it's not good. Usually when there's a miracle, it's all goodness. But he says he's going to give them the kindness of the meat, but then he's going to kill them. It doesn't sound good. So he thought that he would not create meat like he created the man, because meat is impure, and he thought impure things wouldn't come from the sky. And also, if he's making a miracle, God would have said, I'm going to give you a miracle. But here he said, get ready, and he didn't tell them how. So he thought this would not be a miracle. And that was a question. He said, oh, it's not going to be a miracle. Then how am I going to do it? So he thought that he was suggesting it was going to be done naturally. And that's what he was asking. How are we going to do it naturally speaking? So Hashem said, don't worry about it. I can figure out a way to do it without a miracle. There just happens to be some quail passing through. They'll land over here and you'll eat them. Rabbi Yehuda ibn Bilam, who is really a Karaite, and we wouldn't quote him except for the fact that Ibn Ezra quotes him, because the Karaites, as much as we very vehemently disagree with their philosophy, rejecting the rabbinic tradition, they were good Bible scholars to some degree. So he says as follows. He says, Moshe is not saying that God doesn't have the ability. He says, we understand that God could do it. But he's saying that everyone's so hungry, and even if you gave them everything, they would never be full, because the people are, people, and they're never going to be satisfied, because we know hedonism knows no limit. And that's what this part of this parsha is all about. But I'd like to suggest something else. We'll come back to it in a second. But let's look at the structure now of what we have. First, there was a cloud that came and guided them. Then it says that the trumpets would guide them. Then it says how they actually did travel with the leaders and the clouds and the tribes, tribal leaders. It all worked out beautifully. But then there was a problem. They requested Yitro to stay, and he didn't. And as a result, Moshe, perhaps because he missed him so much, like Malcolm suggests, and he loves him so much, he was lonely. He made a radical suggestion that he'd be their eyes, which either means leader or guide, and that could be a sin, possibly. They then traveled from the mountain of God. Perhaps they did so like kids running away from Mount Sinai. Perhaps that was a sin as well. Therefore, it was an upside down noon, telling us how the prayers that were said as the ark traveled and rested. And those noons break up the two sins from before, the sins of running away from Sinai and Moses' sin. And then they have the other sins of the complainers. But look what happens now. So we have the sin of Moses saying, you should be our eyes, right? Let's underline that, right? Be our eyes. That's sin number one, right? He says, be our eyes. So let's underline that. That's sin number one. They traveled like running from the school, sin number two. And we have the upside down noons. And some more problems. Number three, they complained, and they were burnt by fire. Number four, they complained again. They said, we'd go back to Egypt. Then Moshe complains to God, and that's number five. Moshe complains. Moshe asks how God can do what he said he would do. That's number 7 or 6, whatever it is. And then Joshua said, wait, there was supposed to be 70 elders. Why are there 72? And Moshe said, who cares? Which sounds like what Malcolm is saying. We know Moshe. Moshe's modest, as it says in the end of this parsha. He's very modest. And he's not interested in being the leader. He never was. So when they said there's supposed to be 70 elders and turned out there were 72, Moshe said, who cares? Whatever, we don't care. That could be another blunder. We can't have time to get into that one. And then, whether it's number 8 or whatever we're up to, Miriam and Aaron speak against Moshe. So they sin as well. So we have in this parsha 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I believe 8 total possible sins in the parsha. So the parsha, definitely, this is the parsha where we go from the wonderful setup of the Jewish people to the terrible complaints. And then we have, stay tuned for next week when the spies will sin and Korach is going to sin and the whole venture of going to Israel is completely upended and God just starts wiping them out. And stay tuned for Korach, find out why the Jews didn't get destroyed completely. But before the transition to all the complaining happens, there were two possible sins which we examined. One, that Moshe asked Jethro to be their eyes, which is problematic. Number 2, that he perhaps that they traveled like children running away from school, and also this terrible sin of Moshe. I'm sorry, before the brackets, when things were still idyllic, there were at least 2 sins: that running away from God and also requesting a human being, Jethro, to help them guide them through the desert when they didn't really need one. That was even beforehand. And then it gets folded into many, many sins, which take place after the bracketed section, and everything completely falls apart. This book is built like a pyramid. Starts, everything's going up, and they're going to Israel, and everything completely falls down. And then we're going to have a W. We're going to go back up again. We're going to go back up again at the end of the book. But now let's make our final suggestion. So we have two cases where Moshe sort of uncharacteristically questions God. Number one, he wants Jethro to help them guide them when we said specifically just now that God guides us. And then we have Moshe saying, what, you think I can have enough food for everybody? So how can we explain this? So we know if we look later on in the Parsha, it says that Miriam said that she's just as good as Moshe. So Hashem says, wait a second. That she turns to them and she says, God turns to Miriam and to Aaron, and he says to them, wait a second, you're talking against Moshe. Moshe is my servant. How could you do this? He says as follows. Take a look at this text right here. He says, usually I speak to people in dreams, but Moshe is faithful in all my whole house. I speak to him face to face, mouth to mouth. He sees me. There's no riddles. He doesn't say, oh, you see that spoon over there? You see that pot? Like in Zechariah? No. In Chezkel? No. There are no images. I speak to him directly. And what does it mean he speaks to him mouth to mouth? So mouth to mouth means like face to face. In modern Hebrew, they say, my two eyes against your two eyes. Of course, God has no eyes, God has no ears, God has no face. But the metaphor is, just like I'm speaking to you, that's how Moshe speaks to God. So that could be a solution to our problem. We're wondering, what is this? He says to God, how can you give so much food to people? It's okay. Moshe is allowed to talk that way to God because that's how God talks to Moshe. Moshe talks to God. Moshe speaks to God like a friend. And he says, what? Meat for all these people? I don't have meat for all these people. Now, if, I would say that to my boss or to the President of the United States or to someone of honor, that would be kind of strange to talk to someone that would say, what? How can we do that? To get frustrated. But if you get frustrated, with your father, with your brother, with your friend, then, people do that, people get frustrated. And it's okay because God is speaking to them face to face. So maybe we could suggest that since God speaks to Moshe face to face, like one person speaks to another, therefore, don't be surprised if we see some encounters between God and Moshe where Moshe says things that you and I would never say to God, or we would imagine that if we spoke to God, we wouldn't say. But it's okay because Moshe speaks to him more directly. But as far as the first sin with Jethro, perhaps we could suggest something else as well, and that is that in both cases, Moshe was saying, look, soon we're going to Israel. When we go to Israel, things will be much more naturalistic. And therefore, when things are naturalistic, we need a guide, so we need Jethro. And since we're switching from miraculous to natural, I don't understand how we're going to get meat for 600,000 men, plus all the women and children. So there is a transition, and people give the same explanation for next week's Parsha. They say, why did the spies think they couldn't conquer Israel? They had all these miracles. Yeah, but they understood that at some point the miracles would come to an end. They'd have to conquer on their own merit. So the spies said, we can't do it. And there's some logic to that. There's something sinful about that. There's some logic to thinking that the period of miracles is coming to an end. We don't want to live on miracles forever. And that could explain both cases. But there's a most egregious sin here, the sin of questioning God's ability. Maybe it can be explained based on what we have at the end of the Parsha, that Moshe speaks to God mouth to mouth, face to face, person to person. And that's how you speak to a person. And therefore, we don't find that God punished Moshe for this particular case, unless you want to say, like Rabbi Akiva, that he punished him later for the sin which he did at this point. In any event, that's my presentation of Moshe's greatest blunder. Was it speaking to Jethro, which began the decline of the Jewish people? Was it the questioning God's ability, or was it the hitting Iraq later on, which is a whole separate discussion? In any event, I welcome comments and questions at this moment. Thank you for joining us today. Anybody?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Malcolm, for joining us.
Very, very good.
Thank you.
Obviously, everybody has to go through trial and errors to get somewhere.
You mean maybe this is Moshe in the first year, and by the time in the 40th year, he was a different person?
That's right. I mean, leadership is one of the most difficult things in the world. And you sometimes have to bump your head and learn from your mistakes. And he had many stumbling blocks to deal with. And maybe Hashem was helping him remove these stumbling blocks. You sometimes have to make a mistake to learn how to do it the right way. And I think Jethro definitely helped, because obviously Jethro had been a leader of his own people and had the insight into the kind of things that can go wrong. So he was trying to use other people's experience. And I think ultimately setting up the 70 elders is the first form of formal government that anybody's ever had, where you can't be a one-man show. You've got to delegate. If you don't delegate properly to wise people, you can't manage or run a nation.
Yeah, but there's a strange thing. Let's see. So let me just comment on those 2 points. Point number one is that leadership is not built in a day. And the idea that God didn't punish him now, but he waited till later, says, he gave him a chance to develop. Sometimes you have a young leader, you have a new rabbi, you fire him in the first year. No, let him find his way, and then you'll have a good leader later on.
Right.
So that's point number one. Point number two is that, I'm sorry, what was your second point?
So he was using Jethro's experience along the way.
Yes,
It wasn't like he was sinning. He was trying to carry out the right thing. And he ultimately ended up with the 70 elders, where he realized if he had to lead this nation, he couldn't do it single-handedly.
But here's the problem with that. Here's the problem with that.
Okay.
The whole part of the first book, as I've emphasized in a lot of my different videos and classes, the whole emphasis of Bamidbar, Naso, and the beginning of Balotcha is that we have a representative government. We have the 12 Nisiim, the leaders of each tribe. So he said there was a setup for government right away. And it seems that the 70 elders seem to sort of replace the Nisiim, and from then on everything fell apart. It didn't work. The elders was not a good system. In the end, we use that system. That's the Sanhedrin. You have the head of the Sanhedrin, and then you have the Sanhedrin. In the end, it's true, we use that system, but the original idea was not so much the 70, it was the 12,
So,
as I can prove it, because the end of the book, as things get better, as we say, the W goes back up again, and they start marching toward conquest of Israel, and they do conquer Transjordan. When they had problems, people brought their problems to Moshe, Elazar, and the Nisiim, the 12 leaders of each, or the leaders of each tribe. So they had a system. So something broke down there. And I would say that that's perhaps what this whole book is about. Moshe had a system. He knew somehow this system wasn't good. It was broken. He did not have the leadership of the people. So he said, I've got nothing. So he gave them the 70 elders, but it was too late and too little. The system is supposed to be a representative government, a senator from each tribe, and the senators were horrible. He had no Congress, and then they created this Sanhedrin. It was not meant to be, and it was not the ideal. It was Plan B, and it wasn't until they went back to Plan A they were able to march into Israel. Although you don't particularly see it in Joshua or anything like that, but that's how I see it.
No, that's an excellent point, because I saw this period as a trial and error period, and that the many attempts at trying to have a meaningful government. And you are correct that I agree. I never saw it from that perspective, and I appreciate your input in that area. You've clarified something for me that I've always wondered about, and thank you for the clarity on that one. Because really, Moses was creating a constitution with God's, divine input, and it must. I can't imagine having that responsibility. When one looks back, it was truly a miracle in how this all came about and how this oral tradition and written tradition has ended up where we are discussing it today. I'm always blown away by it, if that's the way to put it.
It's interesting. You mentioned Constitution. Many people will say that the Torah says almost nothing about administration.
Yes.
So, for instance, when Rambam wrote his magnum opus, he wanted to have one book about administration. So he called it Melachim, Book of Kings, and he wrote some laws about who's in, who's out, the converts, and the other citizens, people who follow the laws of Noah. He wrote about Mashiach, how he would function a little bit. So he gave you a little bit of guidance, and he wrote about the Sanhedrin in a different book, a neighboring book. But there's very little about administration in the Torah. They say that there should be judges, policemen. Don't abolish the police. There's some policemen, but so that's the general characterization of Judaism. However, there is a suggestion here that there were various types of leadership that were offered. We should mention in this mix the story of Jethro. When Jethro came, he suggested that Moshe appoint other leaders, and it's going to be mentioned in the beginning of Devarim as well. So it seems that there were, leaders of 10, leaders of 50, leaders of 100, leaders of 1,000, and leaders of 10,000. So there was a whole system, but that system seems again to be Plan B or C, and it seems that God had a Plan A. I would say like a tribal system with senators. Plan B is more like a replacement of Moshe. The Sanhedrin is like maybe this Plan B of the Sanhedrin, the 70. It sounds like they are the governing body, but that sounds like Moshe is not in charge. So I don't know if I like it. It sounds like replacing the prime minister with the parliament. I'm not sure what I think. It could be that's more of a Plan B. And then the idea of having a huge administration like Jethro suggested, if every 10 people had someone in charge of them, I don't know. That sounds like a communist system. It sounds problematic.
Yeah,
although,
sorry. Go ahead, Rabbi. Sorry.
No, I'm saying sometimes I think of myself as an officer of the 10s. We have small congregations, so we have officer of the 50s and the 10s. Some people, so when you have congregational leadership, often it breaks down like that. You have some congregations have tens, hundreds, thousands, and then there are occasional congregations that have tens of thousands. But ideally, that seems kind of like overdoing it with administration. But that was actually Jethro's idea. So there's a lot of confusion and a lot of sorting out have to be done to sort out the leadership of the 70 in this parsha, the leadership that's described in the beginning of Devarim, and leadership that's described as Jethro's idea, and how it all works out. But I think the book suggests that the ideal thing was having a tribal leadership as the first tier. I guess you could have another tier of the lower leadership.
Yeah, I always think of the Sanhedrin as possibly, and maybe you can clarify this for me as well. I don't see the Sanhedrin as leaders at all in the sense of governing. I see the Sanhedrin almost fulfilling the role of where there were disagreements about an issue, that they could debate the issue, and that somehow or other this group of, call it judges, would come up with a finding. I find that, for example, the rabbis today are fulfilling the role of where there's a disagreement as to what is halacha and what is not halacha. And so I see the Sanhedrin as a separate, call it a separate form of government that has got nothing to do with leadership. It's to resolve differences or to clarify understandings.
Generally,
I might be
think
using the terminology
Moshe comes. The reason I don't. Generally, I agree with you that the Sanhedrin, certainly in the Second Temple period, played the role of high court. There are only certain things that have to be adjudicated by the high court. However, they do play some executive roles because, for instance, you can't go to war unless you consult the Sanhedrin.
Okay.
So there's some, certainly certain types of voluntary wars, expansionist wars. So Sanhedrin played a role. Also, in this story in Balotcha, it seems Moshe complains that he can't handle it, so he's told to have a Sanhedrin. And to me, and he gives them some of his spirit. So to me, it's a quasi replacement of Moshe. I don't think it worked. I don't think it amounted to anything. I don't see it continuing in the rest of the story. I think it was Plan B, and I think the plan was ultimately scrapped. Joshua seems to bring back the elders, and that was a disaster. When he died, the elders took over, and it was an absolute disaster. It's one of the worst periods of history. But that's why I see it as a replacement of Moshe, because he says, I can't handle it. So he says, okay, I'll give you 70 elders. Doesn't sound like a mere Sanhedrin. It sounds like it's done some replacement. But it's true, throughout the generations, Sanhedrin was primarily the judiciary, and you had the king, executive, judiciary, you had the religious branch led by the Kohen, you had the prophecy direct from God. It's a different branch. So there was some sort of separation of powers, but it was not absolute because again, you had to consult with the Sanhedrin for certain key issues.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for the insight, Rabbi. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all for joining us.
I thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well. Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Nice to have you with us, Mark.
My honor. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you, Rabbi.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Talk to you later.
sharing.
Thanks.
Be well. Take care, everybody.
Good. Take care, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.